Hello and welcome to the State of the Union Breakdown. I'm Michael Schnell. We're bringing you today analysis from both sides of the aisle on President Biden's State of the Union address last night. Here are some highlights from that annual speech.
And to my Republican friends, if we could work together the last Congress, there's no reason we can't work together and find consensus on important things in this Congress as well. And let's also come together on immigration. Make it a bipartisan issue once again. If we don't pass my comprehensive immigration reform, at least pass my plan to provide the equipment and officers to secure the border. And a pathway to citizenship for dreamers. But Big Pharma has been unfairly charging people hundreds of dollars, $400 to $500 a month, making record profits. Not anymore. Make no mistake, if you try anything to raise the cost of precision jobs, I will veto it. The Vice President and I are doing everything to protect access to reproductive health care and safeguard patient safety. But already more than a dozen states are enforcing extreme abortion bans. Make no mistake about it. If Congress passes a national ban, I will veto it. I'm committed to work with China where we can advance American interests and benefit the world, but make no mistake about it. As we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did. That we're not going to be moved into being threatened to default on the debt if we don't respond. Stand up and show them. We will not cut Social Security. We will not cut Medicare. Those benefits belong to the American people. They earned it. And if anyone tries to cut Social Security, which apparently no one's going to do, and if anyone tries to cut Medicare, I'll stop them. I'll veto it. And look, I'm not going to allow them to be taken away. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. But apparently it's not going to be a problem. Because the soul of this nation is strong. Because the backbone of this nation is strong. Because the people of this nation are strong. The State of the Union is strong.
Now, there's a lot to unpack here, so joining me now is Sarah Matthews, former Deputy Press Secretary and Special Assistant to President Donald Trump, and Michael LaRosa, former Press Secretary to First Lady Jill Biden and Special Assistant to President Biden. Welcome to you both. Thanks for coming out early this morning.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
So I want to start by giving you both an opportunity to give your reaction to the speech, what you thought worked, what didn't work, takeaways, set the scene for the conversation. Michael, we'll go to you first.
I thought the speech was really optimistic. I thought he did a good job of sort of taking a victory lap, sort of around his legislative accomplishments, but noting that there's a lot more to do to stick with him. He's a kind of, he likes to play the long game, and I think he's been successful at that when it comes to passing legislation. But I felt like he really enjoyed himself last night. It seemed like he felt really at home there. I think he always has. I think that's a place where it almost looked like he was having a conversation with the other side of the aisle and his own party at times. So I think he thrived up there, and I thought he had a great night.
Sarah, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, to Michael's point, it came across sometimes that the speech turned into a conversation due to some Republicans interrupting him. But I think that this was Biden that was much more lively than we've seen in previous speeches. He was, jousting kind of with the people who were interjecting. He seemed to be passionate. I do think the speech was heavy on touting accomplishments, which, granted, any president would want to do. But given the nature of the economy right now, I think that it was maybe just a little bit out of touch. I understand wanting to explain to the American people what your accomplishments are and what you're doing for them. But I think that right now a lot of people feel as if they're not feeling the effect of those of that legislation that he's put in place.
Coming off that point, and Michael, I want to go to you on this. We saw some polling before the State of the Union that said that some Americans don't actually think that President Biden has done too much in his first 2 years, when legislatively speaking, he has a lot of accomplishments.
Yeah.
Chips and Sciences, the Infrastructure Bill, Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan gun legislation. There's a lot to name there.
Yeah.
The Washington Post ABC News poll I have here, 60% of Americans think Biden has accomplished not very much or little or nothing. 36% said a great deal or a good amount. To Sarah's point, do you think that touting those accomplishments last night moved the needle at all for the American people in recognizing, hey, President Biden has done a lot in the past 2 years. This is what he has done.
I don't think State of the Union's really moved the needle at all for presidents, at least for the long term. I think that Sarah is right. People are not feeling the economy, and when you don't feel it, your opinion is going to be sour, right? If you're not feeling a healthy economy, if you're not feeling money in your pocket, chances are you may vote a different way. But in 2010, when President Obama passed the Affordable Care Act, he was punished legislatively for that. He lost 63 of his seats in Congress because of that bill. But in 2012, when the effects of that bill started taking shape and people started feeling the effects of Obamacare, and they started being able to stay on their parents' health insurance and have subsidized health care, they didn't want that right taken away, and he was reelected.
So it gets back to that idea of sort of President Biden playing the long game. That's how he strategized.
You play the long game. I know Secretary Buttigieg was talking about this, and it's hard to see the impact of infrastructure bill if you don't see infrastructure, right? If you don't see roads and bridges going up. But that image of Senator McConnell and Senator Portman and Governor DeWine and Governor Beshear and President Biden in Kentucky, opening up the groundbreaking for a new bridge, a bridge that is the source of the economy in those two states. People will start feeling that when those projects start moving.
And Sarah, you brought up that anecdote saying that American people just aren't in a good place right now. They're not recognizing these accomplishments, financially speaking. They're not feeling optimistic. Do you think that President Biden speaking to the American people, laying out all that has changed, will move the needle at all for the American people?
I don't think it's going to move the needle for the American people. I think that a lot of people blame Biden's policies as well. They think that it has, increased inflation and things of that nature. And so I don't think that, even though his speech definitely was an optimistic tone for, look how much progress we've made, the American people just aren't feeling it right now. And so the reality is it probably won't move the needle with them.
Let's get into some of the partisanship we saw last night. There was a lot of entreaties for bipartisanship, calls for bipartisanship, let's finish the job, work together. But there were also a lot of partisan moments, notably Marjorie Taylor Greene, Congresswoman, Republican from Georgia, yelled out a couple times, calling Biden a liar at one point. Andy Ogles had said that it's his fault with the fentanyl trafficking. What does that say about the partisanship that we're currently seeing in the U.S., where we have this partisanship during a constitutionally dictated event, State of the Union? It's in the Constitution. What do you think that says about the partisanship in this country, where we're seeing these calling out during something like the State of the Union? Yeah,
I think, Speaker McCarthy did try to tell his party to be on their best behavior, and he was even shushing from behind Biden. Shushing his caucus.
That was an interesting moment.
Yeah, and so I think, he was upset with their behavior, and, I think it's an embarrassing look for the party to act in such a partisan nature. I will say, to the Republicans' credit, Speaker Pelosi, infamously ripped up the speech from President Trump at one of the previous State of the Unions. And so Democrats have also kind of displayed a lack of decorum at times during the State of the Union as well. But it definitely just highlighted just how partisan this tenure is going to be for this Congress, and the uphill challenge it's going to be for Biden.
So you mentioned former Speaker Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, ripping up the speech. I thought it was really interesting that we saw Kevin McCarthy really minding his own behavior last night. Mm-hmm. There were no tactics from him. He was shushing his caucus, his conference. What did you make of that in terms of sort of that collegiality that we saw between Speaker McCarthy and President Biden, something that we hadn't seen in the past in terms of President Trump and Speaker Pelosi on that dais? What did you make of that relationship and how that can move forward in terms of some bipartisan legislative accomplishments?
Yeah, I think that it was great to see that it seems that Mark McCarthy is trying with President Biden. He wants to start out on the right foot. Who knows, given his slim majority, if he'll actually be able to accomplish anything in a bipartisan.
Always a numbers game.
Exactly. And so, it remains to be seen. But I think that for the most part, the way that they're starting out this relationship seems to be good.
What did you think of this, Michael? We saw, I think, 2 or 3 handshakes between Speaker McCarthy and President Biden, and they looked like pretty friendly handshakes.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of refreshing, especially coming out of their first meeting. They didn't have much of a relationship. President Biden has a long relationship with Mitch McConnell. He had a really great working relationship with Eric Cantor during the Obama years. So this is new for both of them, but it was great to see Mr. McCarthy, Speaker McCarthy, and his mother at the state dinner in December. It's great to see them getting off on the right foot. I will say it is a divided country and is a very divided Congress. Joe Wilson, when he yelled out, "You lie," he was censured. We'll see if McCarthy takes any recourse towards Marjorie Taylor Greene. I doubt it, given the rules that he agreed to become Speaker. So we'll see.
We'll see, that's for sure. I want to get to another interesting moment that I found really fascinating at the State of the Union. We talked about President Biden sort of having a conversation with other lawmakers in the House chamber. One of those conversations came when the discussion turned to entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, specifically potential cuts to those programs when it comes to raising the debt ceiling. So to give a state of play, what happened was Biden had mentioned that Republicans want to sunset Social Security and Medicare, and then he said that prompted boos from the crowd. Then Biden said, anyone who doubts it, contact my office. I'll give you the proposal. Mm-hmm. And then when Republicans have been saying, no, point out who this is talking about, we don't want to take it off the table, Biden seemed excited. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad to see. I tell you, I enjoy conversion. And then, so folks, as apparently we all agree, Social Security and Medicare is off the books now, right? We got unanimity. Mm-hmm. It was a pretty interesting moment to see those real-time negotiations sort of happening during the State of the Union in the House chamber. But I think it also speaks volumes for going forward in these negotiations, in this conversation about raising the debt limit, which it has to start ramping up a little bit. Extraordinary measures are set to run out in the beginning of June. So the first question I want to ask on this topic is, do you think that Biden sort of pushed Republicans into a corner to agree in public that entitlement cuts are not on the table?
I think he did a masterful job at boxing them in last night, and there aren't too many opportunities in politics in real time to be handed a gift with a bow wrapped around it. Last night was one of those moments. Republicans want to make cuts. They're demanding a lot of cuts for the debt ceiling, but they won't say what cuts they want. And the only realistic cuts that they could go for are in the discretionary spending, are entitlements. And a marker was laid down last night, and I think that's why you're going to see the president go to Tampa, a population-rich part of Florida filled with seniors, a swing district, a very purple district on Thursday, and he's going to be talking a lot about protecting those entitlements, protecting Medicare, protecting Social Security, Medicaid. But the bottom line is, the debt ceiling is not where you have that debate over spending. You have that debate over a budget, right? The debt ceiling is something that the Republicans did 3 times under President Trump. And the other thing is, it's hard to trust people to negotiate with. 10 years after, they negotiated a debt ceiling, to lift the debt ceiling under President Obama with Speaker Boehner, and they set caps into place. But as soon as they had a Republican president, they blew past the caps. So what good is their word? If they couldn't keep their word last time on debt ceiling negotiations, all it did was spook the market. It destabilized the market. People lost money in their 401ks. I'm not sure the president should negotiate on this.
Sarah, I want to turn to you, on that point of Biden not negotiating on the debt ceiling. That is something that Speaker McCarthy has been very adamant about, saying that we need to come to the table and have conversations about cuts with any discussion about raising the debt ceiling. But also what you thought of that interaction last night, Speaker McCarthy and other Republicans saying cuts to Social Security and Medicare are not on the table. Did you sort of see that as a good agreement in public so then they can move forward and talk about other issues? Because cutting Social Security and Medicare has been a very popular attack line among Democrats.
So I do think that it was a good exchange, and for Biden, to Michael's point, it was definitely a win for him to get that visual of him saying, okay, look, you guys are agreeing with us. I will say, though, McCarthy had already said prior to Biden's speech that any cuts to Medicare and Social Security were off the table. Sure, there are outliers in the Republican Party who want to have cuts, namely Senator Rick Scott has proposed something of that nature. But I don't think it's fair to paint Republicans with a broad brush and say that Republicans as a whole are advocating for that. That'd be like me saying that all Democrats want to defund the police just because there's, a small group of progressives who wish to do that, for example. And so I think that, the majority of Republicans don't want to see cuts happen. But at the same time, I do think that Biden does need to come to the negotiating table and negotiate with Speaker McCarthy about this, because we are going to see, I feel like, a stalemate then if he's not willing to negotiate at all.
You make a good point, especially because I think he was referring to the Rick Scott plan when he had said that he wants entitlements to either sunset in 5 years or be renewed, which was disavowed by several other Republicans in the Senate conference. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell had said this is the Rick Scott plan. This is not the Senate GOP plan. So I think that's a good point.
I think that's why you're going to see the president go to Tampa on Thursday.
Yeah.
And I think he's going to be using, to Sarah's point about painting with a broad brush, like as Republicans do with defund the police. I think you're going to continue to see Democrats do this with Rick Scott and use him as a cudgel because he put it on paper, which is exactly what Mitch McConnell didn't want to do. He's the head of the campaign arm, so this is what he wanted his candidates to talk about. And just this morning, they were releasing video of Mike Lee from Utah, who looked very outraged last night, talking about phasing out Social Security in 2010 when he was running for the Senate. So there's going to be I think you're going to see Democrats use this as a cudgel for the next 2 years.
I wonder now if presidents will try to do real-time negotiations in the State of the Union. I want to turn to another moment. It was one of the more powerful moments of the evening when President Biden introduced the parents of Tyre Nichols, 29-year-old man who was brutally arrested, and then he died days later in Memphis earlier this year. He introduced Nichols and discussed the talk that some black parents have with their children about decreasing dangers when they're pulled over. And then he made this call for police reform. We have some of that sound we'll play right now.
Most of us in here have never had to have the talk that brown and black parents have had to have with their children. We all want the same thing. Neighborhoods free of violence. Law enforcement who earns the community's trust. Just as every cop, when they pin on that badge in the morning, has a right to be able to go home at night, so does everybody else out there.
So a little bit after that, Biden continued and called on Congress to join together and finish the job on police reform. I thought it was a pretty powerful moment. I was in the chamber last night. It got very silent at that moment. There was a lot of seriousness in that moment. But when we talk about police reform, I think that this may be an area where we can actually see some bipartisan cooperation, because we saw work be done earlier. Back in 2021, a bipartisan group of negotiators had said that talks had fallen apart after they couldn't get past some sticking points. But the fact that there was actually a bipartisan group talking, we don't see that very often on Capitol Hill. So I want to ask you guys what you thought of that very powerful moment, and then if you think that there is any room for some bipartisan breakthrough when it comes to police reform negotiations.
I agree. I thought that was probably Biden's most powerful moment last night, really moving. And I do think that there still are some good faith Republicans who want to engage on talks for police reform. I think that Tim Scott from South Carolina was leading the charge previously, those negotiations. He has expressed interest in still wanting to do something. I know that it seems like the issue that Republicans and Democrats haven't been able to work out is qualified immunity, so which shields police officers from lawsuits from families and things like that. I think that previously Tim Scott had said that he would look at not removing qualified immunity, but would look at maybe removing it for the police department as a whole, just not for individual officers. And so maybe there is some hope that we could actually get something done on this. I agree. I think that it is an issue where there is room for bipartisanship, and there's definitely an appetite for it on both sides.
Because I don't think that there's so often that you see bipartisan outrage at a situation, and also the foundation of talks were happening. So do you think that we can see a breakthrough now?
Yeah, I agree with Sarah. I think that if there's room anywhere, it would be on police reform. I think we even saw a lot of this during the Trump administration. Cory Booker and Senator Scott, I believe, were negotiating around criminal justice reform. This president wrote a crime bill in the 90s to put thousands of cops on the street. I'm sure he would love to update with a version 2 in police reform.
I want to hit some foreign policy now. We're running out of time, but President Biden was a little light on foreign policy last night. He made a mention about China. He alluded to that Chinese spy balloon that had been down. He didn't say balloon specifically, but he said, we showed China last week. We will show them in the future. And then he also spoke about Russia's war with Ukraine. Sarah, I'll go to you first on this. Do you think he was a little too light on foreign policy, or is this just typically how states of the unions go?
I will say it is typically how a State of the Union goes. It's usually much more domestic looking and focused on those kinds of issues. But I think that given what had happened with the Chinese spy balloon and that being heavy in the news cycle, I'm surprised that he was so light in his mention of China. And he didn't necessarily call out China for the spy balloon directly. He did say that, they took care of it. I can't remember his exact phrasing. But to me, it kind of came off like a weak response, just with how critical Republicans were of him for his handling of the situation.
Michael, there's still plenty we don't know about that spy balloon. I believe debris either is still being gathered or has just been gathered, but then they have to look at it. So still some questions to be asked, but do you think the president was a little too light in his foreign policy section?
I was a little surprised he didn't lean in a little bit more into Ukraine. After Afghanistan, as you know, the foreign policy of the president was roundly criticized for being somewhat incompetent. But Ukraine and strengthening and adding to NATO and pushing back the Russians has been a real point of pride for the president and the White House. That's why it was important to get that omnibus bill passed in December to front load the next year of paying for that war. He's going to have to be doing a lot of not explaining, but he's going to have to keep reminding the American people how important it is for not just our democracy, but for Europe, that we stay committed to financing and helping to train the Ukrainians. And I think there's going to be a lot of Republicans during spending fights who are going to want to try to nickel and dime and hold accountability hearings on where that money is going, and that's perfectly fair. But the president's going to have to keep up the drumbeat on why we are there, why we are helping the Ukrainians, and why it's important for them to win this war.
I'm sure we'll start seeing some more of that ramping up or coming up on the one-year mark of that invasion happening. For the final topic I want to get to, we're running out of time here. One of my favorite topics, elections. 2024 is just around the corner. They say that after the midterms, that's the first day of the 2024 cycle. Last night was sort of filled with some moments where you could read the tea leaves or try to read the tea leaves for 2024. I want to start with the GOP response before we get to President Biden. That was the moment where Sarah Huckabee Sanders, newly minted Arkansas governor, she had said that it is time for a new generation of Republican leadership, which was interesting considering her former boss is former President Trump, who is a declared candidate for president. We have that sound, so we'll play it quickly.
The dividing line in America is no longer between right or left. The choice is between normal or crazy. It's time for a new generation of Republican leadership. Americans want common sense from their leaders. But in Washington, the Biden administration is doubling down on crazy. President Biden inherited the fastest economic recovery on record, the most secure border in history, cheap, abundant, homegrown energy, fast rising wages, a rebuilt military, and a world that was stable and at peace. But over the last 2 years, Democrats destroyed it all. Make no mistake, Republicans will not surrender this fight. We will lead with courage and do what's right, not what's politically correct or convenient.
Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but you worked in the same White House as Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
We didn't overlap, but yes, both
Okay.
worked for President Trump.
Both work for President Trump. She is now the youngest sitting governor of Arkansas, and she's calling for a new generation of GOP leadership. And I think you mentioned, she didn't mention her former boss by name in the speech. What did you make of that line? Do you think that former President Trump would approve of that? What do you think he's thinking? I mean, it was a pretty interesting line.
Yeah, definitely an interesting line when you really read into it. As there's definitely a large group of Republicans who want to see a new generation and don't want to see Trump be the 2024 nominee and think we need to head in a new direction. So definitely interesting. And yes, as you noted, she also did not ever name President Trump by name. Every time she referred to him, which she was very, praiseworthy toward him and wasn't shielding away from him, but she only ever said my boss or, the former president, which I thought was really interesting as well. I will say this speech definitely seemed geared toward the base. It didn't really seem that a speech like this would appeal to a new group of folks that you're trying to bring into the party or, certainly not independents. It was definitely a lot of red meat she was throwing at the base, saying, we're normal, they're crazy, which I thought was a little ironic, just given that there is a group of voters who think that the Republican Party has become too extreme. And so, I think that it was a mistake for them to focus so much on the culture wars rather than really talking about here's what our economic policy is and, have a, unifying message to the American people.
I want to play one more piece of sound, then we'll get to you on that, Michael. Former President Trump also had his response to the State of the Union. I feel like we're just seeing every year more and more responses from lawmakers and from political figures who want to get their thoughts out. So let's play that sound of President Trump quickly.
Biden and the radical Democrats have wasted trillions of dollars and caused the worst inflation in half a century. Real wages are down 21 months in a row. Gas prices have soared and are now going up much higher than even before. And the typical American family is paying $2,200 in increased energy and food costs each year. Joe Biden's weaponized Justice Department, and I'm a victim of it, is persecuting his political opponents. His administration is waging war on free speech. They're trying to indoctrinate and mutilate our children. He's leading us to the brink of World War III. And on top of all of that, he's the most corrupt president in American history, and it's not even close. But the good news is we are going to reverse every single crisis, calamity, and disaster that Joe Biden has created.
Do you think, Michael, Sarah Huckabee Sanders could have been thinking about that guy when he said new generation of Republican leadership?
I don't know. I don't know where to begin to respond to that. But look, I think Sarah Sanders, it was a smart move to position her generationally opposite of the president, who's the oldest president in history. I thought that was a smart move. I think, I agree with Sarah Matthews that it was probably too hot culturally. I don't think she needed to go there. I felt like you were coming off a very optimistic, happy warrior Biden speech, and it was a very dour kind of very negative, kind of almost searing speech from Sarah Sanders. And the president, I'm not sure. But I do think Sarah is positioning herself very well to be a safe choice on anybody's ticket in 2024.
The GOP response is a very large stage. I have one more question I want to get to you both. We're running out of time, so if we can try to get quick responses. We talked about Trump 2024. Let's talk about potential Biden 2024. By my count, he said, let's finish the job or just finish the job 12 times. And he said that on capping the cost of insulin, Affordable Care Act benefits, billionaire minimum tax. I mean, a lot of things he wants to finish the job on. Michael, we'll go to you first. Does he mean he needs more than 2 more years to finish the job? Perhaps 6 more years? Did you sort of feel like this was maybe the pre-speech for a potential 2024 announcement?
Maybe, but I think he's running anyway.
So you think that he'll be running in 2024?
Yes, he'll be the nominee. He's running. You don't run for president for 4 years, and that includes Joe Biden.
Okay.
I think he's had enough legislative accomplishments to last him 2 terms. I think he's done more in 2 years than many presidents can and have done in 2 terms. More domestic policy achievements since LBJ. He has a lot to brag about, and the only thing that he needs to do for the next year is fund the government and raise the debt ceiling. And
2 very big things that are going to take a lot of haggling.
Exactly, but no one's ever doubted that Joe Biden wants to work with the other side. He says it all the time. It was his Achilles heel in the 2020 primary. Democrats didn't trust him because he wanted to work with the other side. He was too collegial. Democrats thought he was from a different era where there was no bipartisanship that could exist anymore. Well, he did it with the same majority as Kevin McCarthy. He was able to get 300 bills passed in a bipartisan manner, and several of them were pretty historic. Gun safety for the first time in 30 years. An infrastructure bill, which President Trump wanted to do but was never able to do. He's the best standard bearer we have because he's been able to do the job. Not only did he campaign as a sort of uniter and as somebody who's going to work across the aisle, but he's actually shown he can do that. When you put your head down and do the job, play the long game, and you can get stuff done. So I don't think that he needs anything else to accomplish in order to run or get reelected. I think he already has that legacy. I think now it's going to be, the real test is going to be for Mr. McCarthy.
Sarah, I want to give you a chance to respond to that. And if you thought that finish the job, he meant he needs another term to do so, sort of this pre-announcement to 2024.
Yeah, I think that his speech made clear that Joe Biden is running for president again in 2024. I think, obviously there are some Democrats who want to see the party go in a younger, new direction and wish that maybe he would step aside. I saw last night an interview that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez gave where they asked if she would support Joe Biden in 2024 to be the nominee, and she said something along the lines of, I support a robust primary system, but if he's the nominee, I'll gladly support him, which I thought was interesting. Mm-hmm. So I think that, some progressives do wish that he would not run again, but to Michael's point, I think that his legislative accomplishments for the Democratic Party, he deserves to be the nominee again. I also think that any critics about his age, Republicans don't really have room to talk on that, because if Donald Trump, who is seemingly going to be the nominee of the Republican Party at this point, is the nominee, then he's not that much younger than Joe Biden. And so I think that both parties would maybe benefit from having younger folks at the top of their ticket, but I don't think that's going to happen.
And while the president, I think, won sort of the battle of showmanship last night with Republicans on the entitlement exchange, I think what it also showed was it signaled to Democrats that this guy's, he still can fight. Mm-hmm. And he can still fight with Republicans and he can still take them on. And I think that is going to assuage a lot of concerns.
It's a long time until November 2024, but there's a lot to talk about and still plenty of developments to come. Sarah Matthews, Michael LaRosa, thank you so much for joining us. And with that, thank you for joining the State of the Union Breakdown. For more coverage and analysis, make sure to head to thehill.com and follow us on Twitter and YouTube. You can also watch us on your favorite streaming services.